Hi, I'm Pastor Billy Lane. I'm glad to be sharing with you again scripture for this Sunday. And I want to read in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verses 22 through 26. It's a passage about the healing of a blind man. And it says like this. They came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He spoke. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently and his sight was restored. And he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not even go into the village." So here's one more of many miracles that Jesus performed in his ministry. We are used to seeing these account of miracles as we read the Gospels, but this one might surprise you. As we read this account of the healing of a blind man, we notice that it seems like Jesus' miracle didn't work at first. He had to do it twice. He first put some saliva in his eyes and it was restored the man's eyesight, but he couldn't see properly. Then Jesus needs to touch him again, and then we're told that he saw everything clearly. What's happening here? Jesus didn't have the power to perform this as he did so many miracles. Many times he would just touch somebody, or he would say something. He would just send the person somewhere and the person would be healed. Now we have this miracle, and Jesus seems to have to perform it in two steps. Well, first understand what's going on here. Perhaps we need to know two things about the miracles. The first thing is that they are signs. That is, they point to something. They don't have an end in itself. Usually the miracles, they're pointing to Jesus or to something about Jesus. They're saying something about Jesus, about his power, about God, either, Jesus' power over nature or over some diseases and so on. John portrays it very clearly as he calls these miracles signs, because they usually have the function of saying something about Jesus. So in that way, they are pointing or they are saying something about Jesus and about God. But the second thing we need to know about the miracles is that they teach us something. They're used by Jesus to teach his disciples or to teach the crowd or sometimes to teach the religious people. So they're didactic. And as we see earlier in the chapter, the religious leaders ask Jesus for a sign, a miracle. And Jesus actually denies them the sign. And he says he will not give them a sign except the sign of Jonah. Well, it was obvious that they weren't wanting to confess Jesus or to learn anything about Jesus. They just wanted to see a miracle. So miracles don't have an end in itself. Actually, if we think of the whole Bible, miracles happen very seldom. We see miracles there in Exodus. We see in the time of Elijah, and we see this with some prophets, and then here in the New Testament with Jesus and the apostles. But the miracles, they teach us and they point to Jesus. Well, then we may ask, so what does this miracle of the blind man is saying to us about Jesus, and what does it teach us? Or why did Jesus perform this miracle? Again, to answer this question, we have to look at what's going on in this story, in this narrative. And I'll start with the second question. What does it teach us? Or what was Jesus trying to teach his disciples, or the religious leadership, or the crowds that would follow him, and so on? What was Jesus trying to teach with this miracle? Well, go back with me to the beginning of chapter 7. And as we read chapter 7, we'll see that Jesus was ministering. He is in the region of the Lake of Galilee, and then he goes to Tyre in the coast, the northern west coast of the Mediterranean, and then Sidon, and then back to Galilee. And some of the Pharisees and scribes, the major religious groups, or leadership that control the temple in Jerusalem, they go up to check on Jesus, and they start questioning him about his teachings and some of the things that he was doing. And their first question was about the disciples. Why did Jesus' disciples did not wash their hands before eating, according to the traditions of the elders, as we see in verse 6 or 5? Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? Of course, this had to do with the rituals of purity that the tradition taught people to keep. And Jesus answers, quoting a passage from Isaiah, and saying, "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines." And Jesus then tells a brief parable about what turns somebody impure. But pay attention to this, especially verse 16 of chapter 7. He tells the crowd, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There's nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile." This is verse 16. And then after they leave the crowd and Jesus with the disciples, they go into the house. The disciples ask him again about the meaning of his short parable. And look what Jesus says. "Do you also don't have any sense in your head?" Basically, this is what he's saying. A person from outside cannot defile. This he says in verse 18, do you also fail to understand? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not to the heart but the stomach and goes out into the sewer? The issue here, as we see, the religious leaders come to Jesus. They ask about the traditions, and then Jesus answers with the word of the prophet, and he tells a short parable, and he instructs the crowd to understand. Then the disciples ask him again, and he says, don't you understand? Don't you get it? So the religious leaders are not understanding. They're not understanding Jesus' miracles, and they're not understanding Jesus' teaching. But the disciples don't understand either. They're getting confused. Then we move on. He heals a woman and then a deaf person. And we get into chapter 8, and he feeds 4,000 people with just some bread and fish. He multiplies them and feeds 4,000 people. Then is when the Pharisees ask him for a sign. And Jesus does not perform any miracle then, because he knew their intention. But right after this, verse 15 of chapter 8, Jesus says the following about to the disciples. He calls the disciples and says, watch out. Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. Now, Jesus got just multiplied bread and fed a big crowd and so on. So the disciples start reasoning, arguing among themselves and asking, well, maybe did we do something wrong here? Did we forget to bring bread, and Jesus is going to make us now have to feed a crowd again? I mean, what's going on? But look at verse 17. What does Jesus ask the disciples? Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? And look at this. Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? Then Jesus refreshes them about the miracles of the 5,000 people that were fed and the 4,000 people that were fed. And again, in verse 21, he asks, do you not yet understand? So what do we have here? From chapter 7 until verse 21, the issue that's going on is, are they understanding? Or the religious leaders understanding? The crowd understanding? But mainly, the disciples, are they understanding what Jesus is doing? Are they understanding Jesus' words, Jesus' teachings? Then comes the healing of this blind man, the passage that we read in verse 22 and 20 through 26. And Jesus heals this man. He start seeing things, but things very confusing. He can't make the difference between people and trees. So Jesus has to touch him in his eyes again. And then the writer tells us, then he saw everything clearly. So the first thing that the miracle teaches is that some people have eyes, but they don't see it. Some people are blind, but they have their eyesight restored, and then they can see it clearly. Here's a blind man who has his eyesight recovered, but he doesn't see clearly at first until Jesus touches in his eyes again. But it's no surprise that the Pharisees and the scribes, the religious groups, had a hard time understanding Jesus. Maybe they just didn't want it. They were against Jesus' teaching. But for his disciples, who were following him, who were with him most of the time, who were watching him and seeing the miracles he did, who was listening to his teachings, the disciples couldn't understand. So we may even ask, who's the blind here? Who's blind here? Obviously, Jesus is trying to teach with this miracle that some people have eyes, but they can see it. It's easy for Jesus to heal a blind man. It's a little harder for Jesus to heal the sight and the understanding of people who had perfect physical vision. Actually, this is a common theme that we see in the Gospels. Somehow, the Gospels, they portray the disciples as the group of people that had a hard time understanding what Jesus was saying, and had a difficulty in perceiving the meaning of his mission. So we come to our second question. What does this miracle say about Jesus? We'll say that in general, the miracles point to Christ as the Son of God. And John puts it very well in the Gospel of John, chapter 21, verse 30 and 31. He says that Jesus actually did many other signs. He calls it signs, the miracles, which are not written in the book, in his gospel. But he registered several miracles of Jesus in his gospel. And so, quote, so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. Well, see, John didn't want to just tell all the miracles of Jesus, or tell the life story of Jesus, or tell about the ministry of Jesus and all the people that he healed. He told just 7 miracles of Jesus. But for what reason? Not because of the miracles itself, but because those miracles pointed to Jesus as the Messiah. And not only the fact that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God, but mainly that you may believe, and that you believing, you may have life in his name. So the miracles in general have this purpose, to tell us who Jesus is, to lead us to faith, to believe in Jesus, and to live by his name. So this miracle in Mark about the blind man also point to Jesus as Christ. And this becomes actually very clear in the next few verses. Many scholars tell us that here, with this passage, it ends the first major division of the Gospel of Mark. And verse 27 will start the second division of the Gospel of Mark. Until now, we see Jesus' ministry, and from now on, we're going to see Jesus preparing for his crucifixion and preparing his way to Jerusalem and to his crucifixion, suffering, and then death and resurrection. And the next chapters will show and will lead us to this journey of Jesus to his suffering and crucifixion. And I'll say that maybe it's almost as this is the last chance for the disciples, or for you and I as readers of the gospel, to get it, to understand, to know who Jesus is. If we didn't get this far, it would be very difficult for us to see next chapters and understand who Jesus is. Actually, we see in most of the Gospels that the disciples only got it after the resurrection, after they met Jesus resurrected. So right after this account of the miracle, the next passage, we meet Jesus with his disciples, asking them, "Who do people say that I am?" Can you see? This miracle is leading to a question about who is Jesus. And they say, well, some say it's Elijah, some say that John resurrected, and so on, and maybe just a great prophet. And then Jesus asks, what about you? Who do you say that I am? And look at Peter's answer. You are the Messiah, or Christ. Wow. They got it. They understood. This is wonderful. This was so revealing that he, verse 29 tells us, he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. And actually, Matthew is even more emphatic. Matthew chapter 16, verse 17 says that Jesus said to Peter, this didn't come from you. Nothing personal here, Peter, but it was not from you. The only reason you said that is because my Father in heaven have revealed to you. So this is actually a revealing. It's almost like they finally got it. They understood that Jesus is the Christ. So for an instant, it seems that they're ready for more teaching from Jesus. They're ready for understanding other aspects of Christ's mission and Christ's person. It's like they passed the test. They're ready for the next one. They're ready for the next lesson. Well, not just yet. As soon as Jesus tells the disciples how he was going through, go through great suffering, to be rejected by the elders and chief priests, and how he was going to be killed, and then he would rise again, Peter took him aside and started rebuking him. Oh, wait a second. The same Peter that said, "You are the Christ, you are the Messiah." He could not take those words from Jesus. Why? Because his idea of a Messiah was completely different from what Jesus was doing. And then we move on to chapter 9, and we are told about the transfiguration when Jesus takes Peter and John and James to the mountain, and there Jesus meets with God, and they hear a voice saying, "This is my son, the beloved." And then Jesus tells them, these three disciples, the following. He says that they shouldn't tell anyone what they saw, quote, until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So the disciples were to reveal what they saw only after the resurrection. Because only after the resurrection, these things would make sense. Before the resurrection, people would not understand. Not even the disciples were understanding all this before the resurrections. But see, the disciples, they needed to confess, and they needed to understand not only who Jesus was, but what Jesus' mission was here, to suffer and to be resurrected. So what does this miracle say about Jesus? It says he's the Christ. Not the Christ, the conqueror, the king that was to restore the political independence of the state of Israel. He was the Messiah servant who was to suffer, and he was to conquer his kingdom, God's kingdom, and he was to bring his people to his kingdom. The disciple needed to understand this and recognize this, to confess who is Jesus, and to understand Jesus' mission. So when we see this miracle about the man, the blind man, opening his eyes and not seeing things clearly, and then again Jesus touched his eyes, and he can see things, everything clearly. It's a way to tell us that there are things that we need to see with more clarity. And that what the disciples need to do is to not only make the confession that Peter made, "You are the Christ," but also understand the mission of Jesus of suffering and then resurrecting. We know that Jesus had many followers. We can see maybe even today, we can say Jesus has many followers. We Christians are followers of Jesus. Jesus had many disciples. He had a few more closer disciples that he spent more time with them, but he had many followers and many disciples. And he had also some admirers who would once in a while, go see what he was doing. And many of those just like to hear his wonderful teachings and see all these miracles. Maybe some in the crowd, they were just curious to see what Jesus was going to do. But Jesus demanded something else from his true disciples. He wanted them to see things clearly, to understand his teaching, to understand who he was, to understand his mission. And he wanted them to confess that he was the Christ servant. So we, as Christian followers of Jesus, readers of the gospel, we also, as we confess that Christ is the Lord, we also need to see things clearly and to have a clear understanding of who Christ is and what is his mission here in the world, and how he has commissioned us to witness about his kingdom and about his death and resurrection. May the Lord bless us and make us disciples that really confess his name and understand his mission. God bless you.